Hi everyone, my name is Margaret Zavala. I am a non-traditional student, an indigenous Chicana of Yaqui and Oaxacan descent. I identify as Yaqui and Chicana. Currently, I am working towards my first bachelor's degree in the field of American Indian Studies at the University of Arizona. This project proposal consists of the historical Chicana struggles regarding race, gender, and class, which includes societal norms and changing the ideological and social norms of choosing not to conform to the status quo of the two sexual orientations of either male or female, which are assigned at birth in its most basic form. This podcast will interrogate how these Chicanas created and trailblazed their own safe space for themselves before we ever heard of the LGBTQ plus and future Chicano X activists. My research will consist of the Smithsonian Institution of the Chicanos, Chicana X's. I will give evidence of their social justice against social, gender, and class division for these people of color. I'll be referring to some of our assigned class readings, such as Olga, Talamante, de Campesina a Internacionalista, A Journey of Encuentros y Desencuentros, and Maylei Blackwell, Chicana Power, Contested Histories of Feminism and the Chicano Movement. My research will include a book from Lydia Otero, In the Shadows of the Freeway, Growing Up Brown and Queer, and Anzaldúa's book, Borderlands, La Frontera, The New Mestiza, amongst other references regarding the Chicana feminist movimiento. I will also include information from the class readings from author F. Arturo Rosales, Chicano, The History of the Mexican-American Civil Rights Movement. One of the three authors I will be discussing is Lydia Otero. They are part of the Chicana X movement. They have spent decades working in the field of gender, race, and class. Otero was born to a large family on February 14, 1955. Otero was a faculty professor in the Department of the Mexican-American Studies program from 2003 to 2020 at the University of Arizona. Otero grew up here in the town of Tucson in the southwest of Arizona, in Barrio Kroger Lane, which sat near the 80 acres of land that was decimated back in the late 1960s, and approximately 1,000 residents had to relocate due to the reconstruction or gentrification of that neighborhood. The land that was flattened out was where Otero and their neighbors shopped and went for entertainment. This area included the I-10 freeway that shot directly through their neighborhood. This information is part of Dr. Otero's research on how and why the city of Tucson planners dislocated families from Barrio Kroger Lane, which rests on the cross streets of today's 22nd and I-10. According to Otero, when they show pictures of the 80-acre flattened, empty land, this is what a city with its heart torn out looks like. At the future site of the Tucson Community Center, which is now the Tucson Convention Center. Here's an excerpt from November 2010 of Otero discussing her book La Calle at the Mariscos Chihuahua restaurant here in Tucson, Arizona, recording courtesy of 3 Sonoras.
In this photograph, you see this 80 acres, and notice that this 80 acres was the most populated, most densely populated place in Tucson in the state of Arizona. When Steve said that there were other places to build this community center, it's true, but this is where they decided to build this community center, in this place where about 1,000 people had to move. And in this picture, there was like the people from the newspapers and the growth lobby were really felt entitled to describe this place. And in 1969, there was nothing there. There was an empty 80 acres. And I show that photograph sometimes when I do presentations across the country, and I talk a little bit about the La Calle, and I say, and this is what a city with its heart torn out looks like. And I show them that photograph, and audiences gasp.
Otero wrote multiple books, including La Calle, which discusses the ideology of creating a Mexican space, removing all of the Mexicans from that space. They are still a part of the Chicano movement. They spent years in the Los Angeles area in the group GLLU, Gay, Lesbian, Latinos Unidos. According to an interview with the Los Angeles Review of Books, Otero remarks, personally identifying as trans, non-binary, more accurately encompasses my authentic self, my life experiences, and my evolving gender. Olga Talamante was introduced to me via the class readings, De Campesina a Internacionalista, a journey of Encuentros y Desencuentros. Their history caught my attention partly because I had not heard of this side of the LGBT plus community's point of view in my handful of Mexican American studies classes that were part of the Chicana feminist movimiento. Olga discusses their childhood as a child of Mexican immigrants. They had lived and worked in the California fields of Gilroy. Talamante witnessed the farm owner essentially counting the number of children of family members in each family and giving them a ration or portion of their earnings so they would be forced to stay and finish the harvest season to receive their full pay for their back-breaking work. Talamante was only 11 years old when they realized that this was unjust. Olga would grow up and become a part of the Chicano movement. Talamante was a college student at UC Santa Cruz in 1969. They immediately became involved in the United Farm Workers movement around the same time frame. Talamante thought in a more global sense that if injustices like the migrant workers endured, what must it be like for others in third world countries? Olga was not letting the chance go to venture to another country. They jumped in a station wagon with a group of other like-minded activists and headed to their destination. This journey is where Talamante was from August 1973 to November 1974. They were part of a grassroots movement ready for a change, including the creation of a future first aid clinic. As Olga and their group were leaving a meeting, gun-wielding police workers abducted a total of 11 from their group. They were tortured for 4 days and for 4 nights until they were officially booked into the Argentinian prison. Talamante spent 16 months in prison in that country. Their friends created a local effort called the Olga Talamante Defense Committee. Talamante was released on March 28, 1976, and deported back to the U.S. Their harrowing story was surprising, and I felt the need to share this story, whether or not just for my family and this class, but their bravery and resilience is awe-inspiring. This did not slow down Olga, a queer activist. On the contrary, they continued their work in the LGBTQ plus movement today, and recently they have earned them the Latino Role Model 2023 from the Consulado General de Mexico in San Jose, California.
Growing up, I was considered a bit of a tomboy. Played all the sports all the years in high school, trying to make my way in a fairly traditional Mexican family that expected certain things of me. The 60s, 70s, it was a time of exploring and dating boys while yearning for girls. Growing up in Gilroy, in a farm worker labor camp when I was 11 years old till I was about 19, really formed my political consciousness and my social consciousness because the inequalities were so obvious. We lived in one little room with no indoor plumbing and with no heat and no air conditioning. And then we worked under also very dire conditions. No drinking water, there were no bathrooms. We worked really hard. And why don't we have those things? I was part of the anti-war movement, part of building the Chicano organizations on campus, doing the marches, the rallies. I ended up going to Argentina in 1973 because I was a Latin American Studies major. I became then very involved with a mass movement. It was a working class progressive movement. It then devolved into a state of siege where they cut off all civil liberties. And I, along with my folks that I worked there, we were arrested in 1974, and I spent 16 months as a political prisoner. And fortunately, my family and friends waged a grassroots campaign to gain my release. Learning from my years as a farm worker and then as an activist is what really has informed the work that I have done over many years, and that at age 70 I continue to do and look forward to many more years of doing this work in this kind of intersectional way.
Gloria Anzaldúa was born on September 26, 1942, on the border of Texas and Mexico. Gloria was a Chicana, writer, poet, student, and queer activist. They have left their mark on the world with their mestiza consciousness. From their book, Borderlands, La Frontera, the new mestiza, Anzaldúa describes what it's like for the mestiza. They're in the persistent nepantilismo, or nepantilism, an Aztec word meaning being torn between two ways. For the mestiza, because we receive mixed messages about our culture, caught in between two worlds. I struggled to find a video with Anzaldúa by Anzaldúa, but the struggle was worth it.
What happens when you travel from one world to the other is a lot of these worlds overlap. And these places, the interfaces between the different worlds, is what I call borderlands, but I now use the word Nepantla. And what happens when you are in these Nepantla spaces is you're able to shift your view so that you look over here and here's this culture, you look over here and here's this other culture or this other community, and you start holding in your mind, the concepts from both. And when that happens, you start kind of seeing through one culture and then the other. And I want to read a little piece from an essay that I have in this bridge we call home. It's an essay on conocimiento, the path of conocimiento. And it's the last essay in the book. And there's a couple of passages that I want to read to you. Living between cultures results in seeing double. First, from the perspective of one culture, then from the perspective of another. Seeing from two or more perspectives simultaneously renders those cultures transparent. Removed from that culture center, you glimpse the sea in which you've been immersed, but to which you were oblivious, no longer seeing the world the way you were enculturated to see it. From the in-between place of Nepantla, you see through the fiction of the monoculture, the myth of the superiority of the white races. And eventually, you begin to see through your own ethnic culture's myth of the inferiority as you struggle to form a new identity. A new demythologization of race occurs. You begin to see race as an experience of reality from a particular perspective and a specific time and place, a specific history, not as a fixed feature of personality or identity. The second passage I want to read is on the kind of state of mind that you get when you're in Nepantla. Periods of being lost in chaos occur when you're between stories, before you shift from one set of perceptions and beliefs to another, from one mood to another. By realizing that it's negative thoughts, your reactions to events that rouse the beast, and not something real or unchangeable out there in the outer world, you avert being hijacked by past trauma and the demons of self-pity and doomsday ruminations. But you also know that grief and depression may originate in the outside world. You still grieve for this country's original trauma, the most massive act of genocide in the world's history, the mass murder of indigenous people. Before the European colonizers came to the New World, there were 5 to 7.5 million Indians in the territory between Mexico and Canada. By 1900, there were less than 250,000 left. You descended The world's oldest race is 30 or 40,000 years old, and you cry out at the injustice, the waste. You mourn the devastation that the slave trade cost Africa and the United States. You lament the loss of connection to the earth, a conscious being that keens through you for all the trees felled, air poisoned, water polluted, animals slaughtered. Okay, this is kind of the minus aspect of Nepantla, when you are in between these different worlds, in between identities, and you don't know how to resolve the tension in you.
It is imperative that the mestizas support each other in changing the sexist elements in the Mexican Indian culture. As long as woman is put down, the Indian and the black in all of us is put down. The mestizo and the queer exist at this time and point on the evolutionary continuum for a purpose. We are a blending that proves that all blood is intricately woven together and that we are spawned out of similar souls. Anzaldúa had medical issues but was unwilling, maybe unable to slow down. Anzaldúa was working on their dissertation for their doctorate in literature. Sadly, Anzaldúa passed away in 2004 before finishing their dissertation. They received their doctorate in literature from the University of California, Santa Cruz, posthumously in 2005. Final thoughts. The driving force for this topic was how little I knew about the subject matter. From beginning this project, which is the Chicana feminist movement, and my very own need to learn more about these fascinating people of color and the intersectionality that occurs in them. I can connect to some of these readings very directly, especially as an indigenous Chicana, female of color raised in the Central Valley of California in the 1970s as a farm worker. My mother was a young, Yaqui, single woman of 3 young girls with, at best, a 7th grade education. The 4 a.m. early morning from dawn till dusk and working for pennies on the dollar was all I knew as a child. We would go to work. The more rows of grapes we put out to dry so that they could become raisins, the further our money could stretch. The 3 of my mother's daughters quickly learned that you must work or you don't eat or keep a roof over your head. We essentially grew up in a hurried childhood. This phrase was discovered or discussed by psychologist David Elkind, which was first coined in 1981. The premise is essentially parents forcing their children to grow up at an accelerated rate. They're essentially taught to be tiny adults. I immediately connected with Talamante and her childhood as a farm worker in Gilroy, which is not too far from Fresno, California. I connected to Otero as they discussed their beloved Barrio Kroger Lane, where I have resided in the area for about a year here in Tucson, Arizona. I tried to imagine how they felt after losing their brother to the construction site that was near their residence in the barrio. They also lost their grandfather as he tried to cross the newly constructed freeway of the I-10. These were tragedies that Otero shared in their book In the Shadows of the Freeway, Growing Up Brown and Queer. Gloria Anzaldúa kept me mesmerized by their language structured from Spanish to English. I appreciate the premise of the mestiza consciousness and its inclusiveness to each other as an intersectional reality, not because of our sexual orientation or our gender or class, but because we are all humans first and foremost.